Alrighty. I think we may be live. And as such, I'm talking to people. I got my little live chat thing going on. If I'm not mistaken. Alrighty. You have a good loud signal. Maybe it's too loud. And I think I may have fresh new hell to deal with in my actual studio, so we will see about that. If anybody is here, you guys might end up seeing me melting down with stress even more than last week, but I'll explain why. And I got stuff sort of managed, I think, although we will see. This could be the most exciting live stream of your life, depending upon how things work out around here. We shall see. So, yeah, why am I looking at Twitter? Possibly because I amend Twitter and fiddle with it in order to delete areas of it that are not good. And I could also check GitHub and see whether my brother dealt with a update. Hey, Patrick. And no, I did some work over at my brother's place on a video game that we're making, which is mostly me making it, but he wants to watch me make it so that he gets to understand how I think more, because he has struggled sometimes to understand that I think at all, considering that it's not the way he does things. So I've been doing all the work on that over at his place, and last time we did it, we didn't add a certain thing to the GitHub repository, so now I can't get a complete version of that program. So he's available to deal with that, but has not updated it yet. So yeah, I got folks in here. I potentially have more folks than you even know, because here's the thing. Last week, I was going to, and honestly, I could go and get notepaper for this. I like doing it in a certain way. In fact, let me do that. I'll be right back. I like getting notepaper so that if I make notes, notepaper so that I can make notes on stuff. And if I do it with this kind, I can hold it up and show it to the camera. So we're going to maybe do some of that. It's honestly a better way of dealing with it. But I was beginning to explain to you why I'm kind of melting down today, but it's not all about overwork or the family stuff I've alluded to, which likely means that next week I'm going to have to be focusing on other things. Not specifically family things, but it's just like stuff is coming to a head, and more will be revealed. I'll tell you about it if it's important. On the local front, I think I may have another bird stuck in my wood stove flue, which is right over there. So, my happy, cozy home could explode in chaos and mayhem at any moment, and this is really great for my general health. You know, if I do croak on you guys, it's likely to be because a relatively harmless sparrow got loose inside my house and was flying around dive-bombing my head. That would probably get me to stroke out. not necessarily because that's come pretty close to happening before. In fact, once it literally happened. And I survived that one, but it is very challenging to me. So, hi Patrick, hi David, hi Buckethead. Probably not the real Buckethead. If so, wow. Amazing. I love your work. Hi Gamma. So good. David needs to get sleep, kind of like I do. But I do these things with the wood stove, and I can use a piece of paper even to illustrate it. Like, so, stove is here. Pipe is here, goes into the back of the pipe. There are times when birds get into the top of the chimney, because it is a type of flue where many years, like literally nothing happens, but occasionally a bird decides, oh, I need to live in this. And being fairly stupid critters, if they decide to do that, they will typically end up falling down. If they fall down, they end up here. This also has a bottom cap with a couple of screws that hold it on. And then there's this part, which is sort of a expandy joint, and it goes into the back of the stove where there is a sort of big pocket open on the top, and heat comes from the stove, air comes in through the little vent, and sort of bounces off of this, and the hot air goes up over the top of it, in through here, and they get sucked up the pipe. So when the stove is being used as a stove, that's how that works. If a bird falls down the pipe, it starts out here. This is a location where if it's literally in this place, I can put a big black plastic bag over this area, which again, there's a hole up here going into the stove. Remove the screws, and last time I did this, I lost one of the screws, so now there's one screw holding it on. And drop this bottom cap off. If there's a bird literally like stunned from its bad luck inside this bottom cap, and I have a bag tied onto the pipe, there's even a little ridge that goes around it. I can have the bird contained within the plastic bag. Then if I sort of twirl it around, the bird never sees light and doesn't freak out. And it could either be open, or if I've got the bird actually sort of loosen the plastic bag, that's weird and intimidating, but also it means that maybe I could stick the cap back on and then release the bag after twisting it around, and then release the bird out of the bag, basically take it outside. Although I'm warming to the idea of driving to frickin' Timbuktu and then releasing the bird and going, yeah, good luck finding my house again. If the bird freaks out because it's down here, or if it sees daylight through the window of the stove and fights its way through this area to where it is in this area, it can climb up over the sill and then be literally loose in the wood stove area. If it does this, you are not going to be able to open up the front door and grab it. It's too fast. You could also say it's too violent, because what happens is, if you do that, the bird makes a break for it through where it can see light, flips out and goes bonkers and comes at your face. So opening the door is challenging. Also, taking off the top lid is exactly the same problem. You take off the top lid and you get a psycho bird coming at your face in a hysterical attempt to get out at a light source, like the windows I have right here. Now, I have an improvement on this whole situation, but I'm just sort of filling you in on what's stressing me out this morning, because it seems as if I may very well have another bird in there right now. So, opening the door, bad. Taking the top of the lid off, bad. The last time this happened, which was not many days ago, the bird had gotten into the stove. I was shining a light in through the glass, and I'm like, the glass is completely fogged up by ashes and dust and smoke, and I can't see through there, so let's shine a bright light through the glass and peek open this vent. And I peeked open the vent and saw a very, you have to open the stove to put wood in it and set it on fire, so dun-dun-dum. I peeked through the vent and saw this very alert bird staring back at me going, "Hi there." And I'm like, "Oh, I got you. You're busted." Oven plug-in. I'd like to plug in this oven at this point. So what I did actually relates to stuff that I've been doing with the music jams, of which I'm going to be doing another one tomorrow, most likely. I may not actually have to skip any of the music jams. That's sort of low stress enough. I think I can keep those going. But I have shades for these windows now. In fact, I have shades that are so good that I can do a light show in here, and it actually works. So the thing is, technically, I've got a door right there, and it can be opened, quite wide. So if I put the shades on those windows, close up all the doors I can find or get to the point where it's as dark as I can make it in here, hang a drape that I have to further darken the windows on the door to my kitchen area, which is down a hallway over there. It's a tiny hallway. It's like 6 feet. It is now just about possible for me to close up most of my house so that you can have renegade birds freaking out and hiding there to burst up in a big flapping into my face at any given moment, which is bad. I don't respond well to that, so we try to minimize that. I can technically darken everything real good and then open the door wide and just sort of prop it open, at which point, more sound from over there, at which point bright glaring light is coming in through the door, and that is an escape avenue for any given bird that might be around. And that's what I tried doing last time, because it had gotten into the stove area and there was nothing to be done other than basically I set up this situation. I took cover behind the door and I opened it and watched what happened. And sure enough, bird comes flying out. And I would like to get a vent cap, but I can't afford it. I dealt with this in a previous year and couldn't afford it. And so this is one of the costs of poverty, basically, is right now I can't afford a vent cap. I mean, it has a cap, but it's not a bird-proof cap. And I talked to my chimney sweep, who is actually retiring, and that's a drag, but and he was like, he knows that you can put on a kind of cap that is not attractive to birds. It would cost me hundreds of dollars. I can't do that right now. But I'd love to do that in future, because that protects me as well as the birds. And I can easily believe that it is terrified. I'm not so sure if I see the loving part, frankly. That is, I'm not sure that it necessarily connects to. Well, I know, right? Well, the dislike and subscribe thing turned out to not actually work, so that probably wouldn't work either. And honestly, if a bird got loose in here, firstly, that ain't happening. Because although I have taken this part off because I was trying to find and locate and remove this bird, assuming that it is in there, and I haven't entirely finished the story. It's going to be like a half an hour's worth of bird story. I have a dark plastic bag tied over this whole area, and I'm using this sturdy red yarn stuff that I use for tying up cables. And I've got it tied on there good and tight. So even if the bird gets loose into the plastic bag area, it ain't going anywhere. Here's the thing. When this happened the last time, I took some aluminum flashing that I had got to make Eurorack modules out of. I was experimenting with ways of getting stuff that I could, with simple hand tools, put together jacks and controls and things. And I took some and sort of wadded it up and folded it and stuck it in here, blocking off this area of the pipe. And I blocked off the area to the point where I felt like I was pretty confident that if another bird fell in, or if it was the same one because it decides that it lives in my pipe now, it would stay in this area. Thing is, though, I kind of overlooked one concept, which is if it's dark in here and it's light in my room and the light comes in through this area, the bird is going to get up into the entryway of the stove, not be able to get through, and then be hanging out there. Which is not awesome. Because if it's stuck here, it can't be taken out this way. It can't escape through this way and then like dramatically fly out of my house, one hopes, because I didn't finish telling a story about that either. What happened a few days ago was I did this thing of arranging everything so that there was a brightly lit open doorway, and cowering behind the door of the stove and opening it and letting the bird literally fly out because it was hopping around checking out the inside of the wood stove. And at that point, barring like big bird netting, there was no way to capture it. And I would be down with netting, but it would also be kind of loud and crazy and freaky to do that too. So what happens is it bolted out, it made its way for the door, and then since birds fly up, it flew at the door and up, and was like in my front hallway, which is the only area that was particularly bright, up at the surface of my ceiling, and the door sill goes down about a foot before the brightly lit opening was there. So the bird's freaking out, flying against the ceiling. It like can't go down, so it's against the ceiling. Started going back and forth, and then back it goes towards the kitchen, and I go, oh no. Well, no, I'll get there. I'll get there. This is something that I'll eventually fix. But for now, this is one of the things that means sometimes I have to burn out for a week. So I sneak over to the corridor because I'm like, oh God, it's a horror movie. It's going to fly into my face, right? And I peer and go like, has it gotten through into literally my kitchen? And it's going to be hiding in my house somewhere and will burst up at me with a big flapping of wings when I least expect it, because that's awesome. No, it wasn't. Instead, it was perched on the top of the drape that I put across the area. Thankfully, I had it across the top of the door opening way, and it's a darkly colored drape, and I had arranged to make it even more light blocking. So essentially, this bird was perched on top of this drape up near the ceiling. It could have gone farther up into my bedroom, but I had actually closed the doors, so there's an area up there which was then darkened, and there wasn't much going on up there, and there really wasn't a good way to, there wasn't a place to hide up there, so it was just a corridor. And I'm looking at the bird which is perched on top of the drape, and it has not gotten into the basically brightly lit kitchen, because that's another bad place, because that's like brightly lit windows that it will go towards but not be able to escape out of. What I want is for it to go to the brightly lit doorway that is wide open, because it's supposed to fly through that. And I just kind of approached it a little bit. I'm like, wow, that's a larger sparrow than I had given it credit for, but still, it's a small brown bird kind of thing. It drops off, bullets past me, through the door and out. So, that was last week's bird story. So today's day might be entirely full of that, or it might be very anticlimactic, because again, I've set it up so that if I have calculated this correctly, there is no chance it can get through into the wood stove now, because I've blocked off this area. Unfortunately, I blocked off the area in such a way that light can get through, so it's still possible for a bird to be in totally the dark here, see a hint of light there, and go, I need to hop up on this because it's like a perch, and then see more light through the window and then sort of the area here, and go, I can't get through here, but obviously I need to, so I live here now. And that might be about the size of it. It might live here now. In which case, there is not a hell of a lot that I can do, because if it lives there now, I could open the door, but I can't get out. I can shine a light through to see whether it got into the bulk of the stove, but I'm guessing that we can't. Yeah, we'll talk about oversampling in a moment. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. I could take off the top lid, in which case it would freak out even more hardcore, but if the aluminum stuff that I used, which is that Lincane stuff, if that really is making a good enough seal against the back wall there, I've got it wedged in so that it should block the bird and animal entrance, although it could be sturdier, but honestly, it's probably enough. It's probably enough to block something from being able to come through, a live thing from struggling its way through. But then if I took the lid off, I would have freaking out small animal trapped in there, potentially bursting through or potentially not. And the drama of that is nothing that's good for me. I don't like that, so I don't know. And again, I have a plastic bag tied onto the bottom of this, and the bottom cap is removed and inside the plastic bag along with the little screw that comes with it. So in theory, if I needed to, I could sort of grope in the bag and make damn sure there isn't a bird in there, although it's not going to want to go down into darkness, so that's very unlikely. It's going to be like, I live here now. This is the only good place to live because there's light. But if there was really absolutely nothing in this bag, I'd be able to stick the cap back on and remove the bag and go back to sort of relative normalcy. And then it becomes a question of, do I now have a bird stuck in my stove in such a place that it's going to starve and die without being able to get out? So, which honestly might be, if it is a bird that has decided that it now lives in my stovepipe, that's not going to end well anyhow. So, I don't know. More will be revealed. So, Bo has a change of subject, and that sounds like a good idea. I have a change of subject too. We never did deal with the redesigning the collection of plugins in such a way that you can figure out smaller sub-collections. I I didn't get to do that because last week I ended up dropping everything and doing a bug fix live on stream. So there's that. But we can totally talk about oversampling. So by all means, fire up your question. I've also got some minor Eurorack project show and tell to show. And we'll see how that... I took a bunch of my Eurorack pegboard that I use, the perf board that I use, and cut it into two sizes. One of them is 4 units, and one of them, if I'm remembering correctly, is 10 units. And I can show you the stuff that I'm putting together for that. It does see a magical window. It's called the stove door. It is literally a window, but it is of no help because there's glass in it. Or if Bo doesn't have his question ready, I can just show you some of these things right now. So firstly, I'll derail into the question about oversampling when it shows up. I have a new... Oh, here's the question. So how do you implement oversampling? We can keep talking about birds if you want. It's strangely topical today. The way you implement oversampling in a plugin is like this. You implement a sample rate converter and run enough latency that you're doing a sample rate conversion to a higher sample rate within the plugin. You do your calculating. Yeah, pretty much I do. And then you run another sample rate converter and convert it back down again. You see, this is why when Whitesea goes on about running at high sample rates and stuff, that's actually a better idea than doing plugins with oversampling. Honestly, I feel that plugins with oversampling is a terrible idea, although there are some kinds of plugins where it's a fairly natural fit. Like something like the Kazrog Clipper that famously does spectacularly high amounts of oversampling. That is an appropriate choice for doing crazy amounts of oversampling because it is a hard clipper. It's trying to generate a digital signal. I wonder whether I should try to dig up another piece of paper for this one, or the other side of that one piece of paper that has a stove on the other side. And I should draw a bird. Just a minute, drawing bird. Had a bird. So, what you do, it's about to get cooked. How do you mean by me? No, I approve of it, but here's the thing. Stove bird. Rain Birds, Tom Waits piano instrumental. Where are we looking at? So if you've got a signal that is going to do a hard clip, anytime you hit this hard clip, you're creating incredibly sharp corners, and the sharp corners are going to produce aliasing because the overtones that you're making are not properly related to the legal sample information for the sample rate that you're at. So what you do is you do a sample rate conversion inside the plugin to run an incredibly high sample rate. And you do your clip on that incredibly high sample rate. And then you resample back down. And in doing that, you're throwing away the overtones, and you're still going to maybe get a tiny bit of aliasing. It's difficult to get absolutely no aliasing. Like 128 times, 250 times oversampling is what you wind up getting if you're doing literally a super hard clip. Now, bear in mind that all of the stuff that I've been doing recently, like density, spiral, mojo, dyno, these are all forms of soft clips. If you're doing soft clips, it's going to make an area near the top of the range that starts to go into a clip. And what that means is it's going to curve to some extent before going into full clipping. And when it does that, it's not generating as many high overtones as a simple kind of naive hard clip would do. The downside of it is that now you have this transition period, and typically when stuff goes into clipping, the point at which it hits this point and soft clipping starts to engage is both perceptible and really unpleasant to people. People do not like it when their transfer functions change rules in midstream and start going over to a curve or something like that. That actually exists in my Crystal plugin, and I put that out because the guy really wanted it. But it has what's called the new channel algorithm, where there's a area of flat in the middle of it, and then it goes into the curve. And even though it's only a change in rate of change, people found that version of channels so obnoxious that it was a complete mutiny, and I had to put it back. And that taught me much. So the problem with soft clips is that you can do the soft clip, but people freak out and dislike the sound when you have a sudden change in phase or direction or curvature or something on the audio. It's like, we're going through this audio, going into this area, and there's something wrong happening here that you can hear the waveform moving through it, and something's happening at that point, and it sounds extremely bad. Oddly, that's also something that happens in a classic old school tape sim that's not by me. A tape sim that is literally called tape. And you can test out these soft clip things or anything like that by running sine waves of ramping volume into them. And that can be done in a number of ways. One of the ways you can do it is to generate two really high resolution sine waves at like some base frequency, and then have them be almost exactly the same frequency, at which point they'll start amplitude modulating. It'll act like one, but it'll be going up and down in volume. And if you hear any flangey behavior or weird overtones, that is a dead giveaway that there's something going on in the transfer function that's at a fixed place in the amplitude, and people are going to find that annoying. So that is, that's the way to get around needing to use lots of oversampling. But there's a catch, and that's why Spiral, Mojo, Dyno have been pretty successful in that they're a more complicated grade of curve. So there's no one spot where anything changes abruptly from one condition to another. Because apparently you can't do that in audio without it sounding bad. And so they don't. They're very smooth and fluid, and anything based on Spiral. I'm hearing more noise from the bird in the wood stove. Anything based on Spiral Also has a smooth, holy crud, that was a loud noise. A smooth curve through the 0 point. And that was the innovation that Spiral did. I think the bird is trying to fight its way through the metal grating. I think that's what's going on. Wow, this is going to be the most stressful stream ever. Wow, even more so than when I was fixing the bug. If one bright side is if I stroke out on camera, then somebody can get in their car and run over to save me. Don't call an ambulance because I can't afford one. Anyways, give me a second. I'm going to point this microphone in this direction, and I think I'm even going to point the camera. Let's go full Monty. This is going to be an adventure. Dun dun dun. Let me see whether I have this lined up good. I'm sure it did. I'm sure my face did turn red. How'd you like them apples? You hear that? I bet you heard that. We got a plastic bag tied onto this. Something else maybe I can do is go and get that light. So yeah, if I die today of the drama of all this, I will have been killed by a sparrow. That's humiliating. And I know you heard the noise just then, but because it was totes loud. But I do not know what else is going on. I never planned to have this be the stream, I'll tell you that. So I'm assembling this little light on a string because I can try to shine it in through here and see if there's anything in here. Like so. And then like so. I'm looking in through this little thingy here, and I think part of the problem here we'll leave that there. So the string tied around this bag is over the ridge inside the bottom of it. Uh, okay. Inconclusive. Okay, so I'm back on mic. And you know what? Yeah, it's no grand surprise if I went red on that one. So yeah, that's inconclusive. What just happened there is I got the stove, and I got the thing, and I've got a big plastic bag hanging off of this. It's tied on real securely with like sort of big heavy yarn length stuff that I use to tie up cables, and is not coming loose. And the bottom cap is inside the plastic bag and loose. So there's a bird that has gotten up into here. It's almost possible maybe to use the plastic bag as like a kind of glove, reach up into here and grab it and try to pull it down through into this area. I'm not sure that's really actually reasonable. I took this area here, which is sort of the heat shield, and air goes over the top and into the pipe. And I blocked it with Lincane aluminum sheeting, like mesh-like stuff. This was actually a mistake because I could have blocked it with something totally and completely opaque, in which case this wouldn't be happening. But since I blocked it with aluminum sheeting, I now have a enraged sparrow in my wood stove, which you heard. You should have heard it on stream. I know I pointed it at a I know I pointed the microphone at it and then just had a burst of madness. There's a bird in here that is trying to rip its way through aluminum mesh to get to light. The light being in the stove, coming through from the light in this room. I shone a light through the impossible to see through window here. Honestly, but when I clear this up, I'm going to be wanting to clean that so that it's possible to just look through. But what I did was like shine the light through the opaque glass, which is all like fogged up. And yeah, I know a tweet is trying to kill me. And I cracked open the vent, and I peered through the vent, and it looks very much like the bird is not loose inside the stove, which is kind of a drag because I took a gamble in like releasing one into my house and hoping that it went out the door the last time this happened. And it did, in fact, go out the door, not the first try, but it came pretty close. It was almost going straight out and end of problem. I would rather catch it in something and remove it. Well, there's that, or I could simply put light over the front of a drape over the front of the stove, and then it would shut up. I can at least do that. So that's definitely a possibility. That, or I could try to lure it into the bag. That would be interesting. So what I would do to do that, there's another possibility, although I'm not sure if I want to deal with any of this on stream. Maybe I'd rather do it later. If I put heavy, like a coat or something, over the front of the stove, bird will definitely stop freaking out. It's probably a sparrow. And that is because if it's dark, the bird's not going to try to fly. That's why it hangs out in the back of the stovepipe and doesn't do anything until it tries to get through and then starts freaking out in the actual stove area. There is aluminum lincane material. I'll even go and show you, as long as we're As long as we're running around doing things, I'll do a couple of things. Thing one, thing two. Okay, now things are going to get either a lot calmer or a lot more interesting. Because, no, don't not dial 911 if I have a stroke on camera, because they'll have to call an ambulance and I can't afford an ambulance, so let's not. Here's the deal. I've just put a jacket over the front of the stove. Now there's no light coming in, so wherever this bird is at, which is probably up in here, it ain't going to be doing nothing. That said, there's a possible exception. And maybe, well, now it doesn't matter. I have put a big coat over the front of the stove. What that means is that there's no light going in through that window anymore. So it's as good as turning the lights out in the room. It's fine. Also, give me a second because I'm going to do something else. And I'll let you watch too. Although with any kind of luck, this is going to be less exciting. See? That's a coat. And bird friend is not in this pipe, but in the back edge of this stove, where it sort of opens up into an area, and it was trying to get through this material. I put it inside the stove and folded it up in such a way that it like blocked the path. So that's where all the chaos is coming from, is the things trying to get through there. At this point, if light comes through the bag more brightly than through the jacket, the bird could try to get out towards whatever light it could find, towards that bag, and then fall down into that, and then flap around even more loudly and insanely, although at that point it would be in the correct place. So, what I'm going to do is reach down into the bag. There's nothing in here right now. Okay, now there's a limit to how much insanity can happen. In fact, I could even return to work, in a sense. So the reason there's a limit to how much insanity can happen now is because I've just taken the cap that goes on this thing. It is a solid metal cap that goes over the bottom of the stovepipe, and there's a screw that goes in it. If I put that screw in there as well, which is not going to be possible, the whole thing would be bolted up so closely that ain't nothing that the bird could do, and it'll also be in the dark so it won't try to fly. So basically it's like, okay, I now have an unorthodox pet in an unorthodox cage. Go figure. That also means that I can experiment with trying to, for instance, get a different color of garbage bag or something, or take the garbage bag, take this off, open it up even more, and take that bright light that I had and shine it against the bag in hopes of trying to lure the hapless, neurotic idiot bird down through the bottom of the pipe into the bag, which I can then twist around, tie off, remove, and technically I could even, if I was really careful and really brave of the terrifying sparrow, yeah, I know, because they do get pretty freaking violent, even though they're tiny and feathered and cute. They're less cute when they're like trying to rip their way through aluminum linking paneling. But technically, if I was really clever and it got loose into this like bag area, and I was able to stick the vent thing back onto the pipe with the bird loose in the bag, maybe sort of twist it around into some kind of area, I could remove the bird in the bag. Well, this is always complicated. Let's see. What are we doing here? And stick because the downside of dealing with it this way is if there are two birds, my world becomes a world of hurt. And I'll tell you why. Because the bottom part comes off. If I'm lucky, I manage to work it in such a way where birds can't actually get through this area and are stuck in the removable part. I would have to hire a chimney sweep to go to the roof in order to put on the wood stove pipe cap, which is why I can't do that myself. It's not a smart thing for me to do myself. I don't have construction experience. So the downside of having the paper bag, the plastic bag technology there, is that if it's fallen through and I've designed it in such a way where I can actually, I've done this once before. I can actually isolate a bird that gets through there, take the cap off inside the plastic bag, drop it, and have the twist it around, in which case I will have a bird imprisoned in a black plastic bag and it won't freak out because it's dark. And then carry that outside, open the bag, and sort of like prod it, wait for the thing to be like, daylight, boom, and burst out like a maniac. But while I'm doing that, I have this pipe open to the floor, and if a second bird was up there, it would fall down the chimney, assuming that it's that kind of dumb like the previous one did, and fall down the chimney and literally fall through into my frickin' room. At which point there would not be me there to direct it to the door, so there would be every chance that it would go somewhere stupid. Actually, as a matter of fact, I do, so maybe it's karmic justice. I buy a lot of chicken breast for stir fry, so go figure. These would not be good to eat. So basically right now, oh, David, I'm reading some of the chat, and I shouldn't be trying to read the chat. Yeah, I've got everything all sealed up, and in fact, I took the bag, which is still tied onto here, so it's just multiple stuff going on. I am no vegetarian. I eat birds. I also eat ground beef and tacos, although I try to sort of minimize that because it's a really lousy use of... we've had the vegetarian and vegan conversation in here before. Honestly, it's better for the environment and the world in general for people to do vegetarian and vegan. But I get by on very little food anyhow, so I kind of... Anyways, this should be all sealed up at the moment, and it's so dark. It is so dark in there that ain't nothing happening. And I promise I ain't gonna eat that bird. It's all covered with soot. I need more coffee. Well, I mean, I'm just talking about efficiencies. Like, you grow, 1 ton of grain to feed what? Like 1 ton of vegetables? Well, 1 ton of grain to feed 1/10 of a ton of vegetables, to feed 1/100th of a ton of cows, to feed 1/1000th of a ton of humans. And it's like, yeah, that's not an efficiency thing. That's not great. I have all the respect in the world for the vegans people who are trying to go that way. That said, as long as things have calmed down just a tiny bit. No, if I turn on the stove right now, I actually managed to extricate the bird the last time, like a week or so ago, without killing it, and I liked that. So, seeing as things are fairly likely to have quieted down for the moment, and I might just have to wait for the dumb thing to starve. I don't know. I do the best I can with it, but maybe what I can do is show you some other projects. We'll distract by talking about some other things. Here's a thing. This is a thing that is inspired by a guy's noise generator project. He took a 40106 chip, which is a CMOS Schmidt trigger hex inverter, and set it up in such a way that multiple inverters were feeding back using these resistors to kind of slow them. And they were all tied together in a weird way where it kind of freaks out. So the guy posted a circuit saying, "Oh, I came up with a 40106. I think that's the correct one. Actually, I have one right here and one right there. Or, no, this is a different one. And one right here. But I can't read them because they're too small. If you set the controls just right, and this is a 100, this is a 100K pot, this is a 200K pot. If you set them just right, it bursts into sort of loud, weird, white noisy type stuff. And it does that when you power the chip. So my experiments around this have been along the lines of, how do you power the chip? And I've got stuff like this. This is a enclosed header that is for the purpose of being in a Eurorack system. This is where you get your power from. You plug it into the power supply, and you get plus 12 volts and minus 12 volts and stuff. If you have a larger header, you can get 5 volts too. But control signals are also voltages. So this was heard last week on the live stream. There was a sort of techno-y zwip noise that was a percussive element, and it was more than I usually have. Usually I just have a backbeat or a hi-hat or something. I have a thing for that. But this was heard last time. And what this is one of those noise generators set up and wired the way that it gets wired, with a feedback knob, which is this 100K pot, setting the frequency for it. What you do is you set it up so that you dial it to a particularly high frequency and it goes into sort of weird chaos, and at that point it's acting like noise rather than like a frequency. And a output, and that's not an input, that is the power supply. It is being activated by the power supply coming from the actual trigger, the gate input in the Eurorack. So this is a unpowered circuit. And I've got a rough draft of it here, although it's a little bit funky because I don't have all the bits yet. But the idea is you set up this chip with the wiring that I showed there, and one of the controls is the frequency that it runs at, so you can dial it down. Yeah, well, it took a little bit of trouble to get it to do the high-pitched percussive noise, because what it wants to do is either a sustained noise like any normal oscillator, or a sustained note like a square wave. It's actually not easy to get it to sort of spaz out and do the noisy type behavior, even though it's wired up in a funny way. But that just makes it more interesting. What that means is if you set it up that way, you can have the power supply coming from the top input, that's your gate input, and then you run it through another potentiometer, so it becomes a sort of power starve, and that makes the chip run on lower voltage. Oddly, what happens is that when you have this particular thing running powered by a trigger, especially if it's a low, it's not pulling many amps when you've got it running through a potentiometer and just blocking the resistance, but the lower power you give it, the higher in pitch it goes. Which is interesting and also a bit of a problem, because I had a plan for making a kick drum that worked by the same principle. And I will be able to exploit this principle more in future. Just it'll have to be kind of different. Where I was going to do a kick drum where if the frequency dropped, and I may still be able to do this in some way. David. I have had lots of friends that are that kind of funky, so don't worry about it. If I can come up with a way to have it so that if you feed it lower voltage, the frequency drops, and that could also be through having an LED and a photocell, basically putting a Vactrol in there. And I can build those myself, and you can also buy them. Mr. Bird is alive, but not freaking out because everything's dark. Not only that, if there's any wild, chaotic noise going on there, it means I have my chance to let it free. Because the only thing it can do that is really aggressive at this point is get back into the main area and make the bottom fall out, which puts it in the bag, which means I can remove it. You mentioned putting 9-volt batteries on it. There's actually a 9-volt battery glued to the bottom of this perf board. And I have a way of power. In fact, the 9-volt battery is wired to the bus bars here. Like, this is plus and this is ground. And when I connect the battery up, I can power a bunch of stuff off of this. But yeah. So what you do is you set it up in such a way where the thing runs only when the gate signal is being fired, and then you give it a envelope output, like the Moog DFAM, the Moog Mother32, all kinds of stuff can give you envelope outputs. You can get dedicated envelope outputs. You can build envelope outputs. All those things are very possible. So if you can power a chip, and you can, on only an envelope output, what you start getting is like crazy circuit bendy style behaviors, because you're not only powering the chip to make a oscillator, but you're also powering the chip with an unpredictable voltage source that does a bunch of other things as well. So, yeah, back in the day, birds were dinos. I mentioned dino, and maybe that's the sign, is that this is going to be the one that people really love. Who knows? Who knows? Certainly, dino is the one where it makes your mix be like powerful and raging and out of control. So there is that. Just not loud. Not loud like Mojo does. So some of these things are sitting around because, like, I need to use these capacitors to run the circuit. Here are the potentiometers I'm using for adjusting the amount of general voltage that it gets, and also adjusting the frequency, because this is the frequency feedback knob, and this is also the place that I could put a Vactrol in and essentially have it be only goes to high frequency when voltage is coming into the, because you can fairly easily use a trigger or a gate or an envelope to fire an LED. All you got to do really is, wire up the LED to the jack and maybe put a potentiometer on there, or you can you can tap into it after it hits this potentiometer. And no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't hide the fact that you laws around it and then bug DSM. Remember, DSM is made by Paul Frindle, and he doesn't agree with me on all things, but I think he's nice, so. He's already dealing with some support burden from some other stuff. Somebody else was having difficulties with an earlier version, and it's like, yeah, I can't bug fix that because we've moved on to the newer version, and in fact, another company did the coding for me for that, so he's facing stuff. He doesn't need to be bugged by things. So these are switches. And they are here, although they might not stay here. I might build one that's much simpler. Because this is a way that I can switch in different capacitors. On this one, I have an arrangement that there's a capacitor and they're in here somewhere. Yeah, this tiny metal thing. A diode. What this does is when a gate comes in, it fires the voltage of the whole circuit up. And you can see there's another one of those chips up here. It's powered. What happens is the gate comes in, it powers the circuit, it fills up the capacitor with power. It does it fairly quickly. Oh, Ahmed, you should check out the playback on this when this goes on to the web. It's been a colorful live stream. Honestly, I'm kind of looking forward to when we get through to the end of my live stream, and then I can sort of quietly figure out what to do with the rest of my afternoon and solve this strange problem. David. You can make comments like that as much as you want as long as you don't bug people using my plugins as a prank, because that's not... I'd prefer not to have people bugging people using my plugins, no matter how exciting it might seem. So, what happens when you do that is, I tell you what, this bird is listening to everything I say. It's going to go off and form another plugin company that competes with me. Your gate looks like this. It goes to full voltage, and then it stops. That's what a gate looks like. If it was a trigger, it would be much shorter. If it's a gate, it stays open as long as the sound is going to be continuing. If you do a capacitor in there, what's going to happen is you're basically running the, here's your voltage, here is the place it's going to. If you put a capacitor in between, and this is the symbol for a capacitor, what happens is the voltage comes in, it goes through to the output, it stays high for just a moment. In fact, it slows the attack slightly while it's doing that. It will slow the attack very slightly depending upon how it's set up. And then depending upon how big this is, and whether it's like drained or whether it's sitting there with voltage inside it like it was a battery. This is how you get a pulse shortener. That starts out with no charge in here. The voltage comes and charges, and while it's not filled up with energy, it lets power through. And then once it's filled up, it can't contain any more, and then it starts blocking energy. This is also why, if this is not a simple voltage but a vibrating positive and negative thing, if this is a frequency, in other words, and it's higher frequency than the stop band of the capacitor, and a capacitor serves as a filter. It's like a capacitor is a high-pass filter. If the voltage is in the form of a frequency, then it will continue to be let through as long as there are frequencies that don't fill up the capacitor completely and stop it from letting anything else more through. This is also how you do a pulse shortener that makes its own gate. Because what you do is, oh, David, only you use U-Law for mastering. All the time, well, it's probably possible to come up with a way of doing it reasonably. If you have another Schmidt trigger comparator, which does the thing of, it's going to be on if the voltage is above a certain amount, and off if the voltage is below a certain amount. So this could be either a comparator or a Schmidt trigger, meaning that it turns on here and then it turns off here. If it does that, what you get is another output that does this. You have made a shortener that's still a gate. And if you make one like this using, your capacitor, and typically you're going to want to have resistors to ground because it drains the power out of the capacitor so that you can use it again, or sometimes diodes to ground, a way of making it so that only positive stuff is here, but if there's negative stuff, it just automatically gets blanked out. The purpose of doing that is to prevent there being an additional waveform, like when it releases this, when the waveform stops and lets go, if the capacitor changes, you might have another unanticipated gate sticking in there. And I was getting some of that last week on the music stream. You can hear in the weird, funny little sound that I made using this circuit that there were some things I was doing with it where it'd do a sound and then there would be a click in between sounds. So I just used it as part of the music. But that's one way of doing that. And if you're using a comparator, like you got this thing going on and you've got like some kind of chip, it's doing whatever, and then you're doing this, capacitor thingy and all this stuff, which is taking it to another thing. I can even show you how that even works. It's easier to do it as an inverting one, I believe. So this is an op amp being used as a comparator. You got something coming in the negative input, so it's going to flip it upside down. You're going to need to invert the phase of it. And then the output goes back into the positive input. What that means is that if the output is positive, it's only going to get more positive. And if the output is negative, it's only going to get more negative. The smaller the resistance between these two things, the more intensely it's going to force the output to go a certain way. And this has its own power supply and stuff. inputs to things like this are often fairly high impedance, so it's not going to be draining a bunch of energy doing it. And here's the neat thing. If you are using this stuff and going through, you're changing the length of the gate. This is a really long gate. You maybe want to have a short little percussive note. You can make a cowbell kind of sound out of just a couple of oscillators. You could do it using this. You could just make, throw some little capacitors and resistors in there and have as many as 6 oscillators off of one of these chips, power it with a gate, and all the oscillators will start going until you take away the power, at which point it stops. The frequency kind of goes zip up and it stops making noise. And since it is, Bo, re-ask a question if I missed it. Since it is being silenced through taking away the power to the chip, guess what? Zero noise. That's an advantage to this strange way of doing things. We don't normally do things this way. Normally we have free-running oscillators and we try to gate them through some other circuit. But if you kill the power to the actual chip, it's not producing any sound or any noise or anything else. So, and if you're using this technique to shorten the gate by just charging up a capacitor, having it drain, fill up to the point where you can't put any more energy through it. So the output, the voltage does this. And then you feed it to a comparator, like this op-amp arrangement, which makes this happen. This gate is now pulling power from the power supply of this comparator. So you've just isolated the power drain for everything you've done over here. Now I see the question. From the input gates and things coming in. And that can be useful too, because there's a lot of stuff where you start throwing voltages around and it does weird things to the circuitry. Like, you can power LEDs and things off of gates, but there are times when, you do that and it might drain on the previous circuit, or like, this is 6 different inverters. So you could run 6 separate circuits off of this one thing, but if all of those circuits are very high powered and use a lot of voltage, you're going to start overheating this chip by running it and then putting all of these massive voltage drains on it. That's one reason why the Eurorack WASP filter is inconsistent, irresponsible. The WASP filter is unreliable, because a WASP filter is made out of one like this, except for that they're like 4049s or 4069s. They're unbuffered inverters, not Schmidt triggers. But the WASP filter uses those biased into the middle of the range. It uses them as FETs. It uses them like the old Craig Anderton tube sound fuzz circuit. And I love those, but the WASP filter uses all of the inverters that way. And when you use all of the inverters that way and bias them all to be half on and half off at all times, the entire chip starts sucking huge amounts of power and overheating. And in the WASP filter, which I haven't made one of, but I've got the parts to, so I should try, it'll start heating up because you're using so many of these biased into half on, half off, and they're putting all of it, they become type A amplifiers. They put all of the energy through them at all times. Now let's pause away from this. I've got this circuit, which can actually be more complicated. Like, I can start sticking caps on various places. This isn't going together the way that I wanted. Maybe I wanted to go on the other side. I can find places to put these other parts on, and the switches are for choosing between different caps in the hopes of having different lengths of gate for this. And I'm also working on this, which is the redesign of the SiDemon. And that is a counter chip. And here's a bunch of jacks and things. These would be extra buttons to push for if you push this button, you start passing through the raw input trigger through to whichever output this relates to, through a diode so that it doesn't, things are always on if they need to be on. And the arrangement of switches, these are cheaply available switches that exist in a form where you can get them to sit on this perf board. And piece falls off, yay. I'm going to have a set of LEDs because I got a whole mass of incredibly cheap LEDs that are yellow. And and we're going to have to go to top chat. The LEDs are going to trace down this way. The actual chip seems almost random in the way that it does, but if I wire to the switches correctly, you're going to have a little LED stripe going down, and based on which one is engaged, and the switch is there to say which output that pulse goes to. So it's a nice sort of little mechanical kind of thing going on. Meaning that you can set it like this, like 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, and then 4, 4. Meaning that it'll be output 1, output 2, output 2, output 2, output 1, output 2, output 2, and then output 4 gets wired to the, maybe I'll even, I can even sort of have it normaled to this. The reset input, meaning that as soon as it hits that input, it goes back to 1 and is 1 again. And in doing this, you can change the cycle length on the fly from 10 to anything else. Like you can have just 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 by going 1 and then 4. And I can normal that to jack 4, or I can just have a tiny cable that always connects jack 4, which is going to be this one here, to the reset input. And this has been redesigned a little bit from the first incarnation of it that I put together because I needed to have space for the LEDs. I may or may not find ways of having also LEDs for the output jacks, just so that they flash at relevant times rather than you just being able to hear it. But I also got to find a way to put the power cable, because this one cannot be powered off of just only a trigger input. I would like to make a bunch of things that just get powered off of the trigger inputs, because that's also stuff that I can use on the secret briefcase design. Here's another thing that you can do with that, where if you take this material and just put it on stuff, you can start putting together the chips and things, and using like IC sockets of a particular kind. And when you choose IC sockets of a particular kind, you can plug these into them and unplug them and put them back and have it be a pretty good connection and repeatable. So that's the idea. Is on the one hand, I've got some stuff like these, which I'm putting together, and I may be able to have one by tomorrow for the stream. Otherwise, I'll just like wire this up again and I'll use this on the stream. And these have these jacks, and the jacks cost about $1.25 or so in bulk. Or have stuff like this where it's a similar kind of thing, but we don't have these jacks anymore. Instead, we have these tiny little IC sockets that you plug the jumper cables into, and then it's all based on the jumper cables being plugged into stuff. It becomes much more microscopic. I would have to be wearing my reading glasses to use it. But it also means you could fit more into a given space, and just consolidate it all together. And then you look like a mad scientist or some kind of bomb-throwing madman, because you have a crazy circuit that looks kind of like one of these, except for that it's on actual perf board, and it's all kinds of stuff scattered around. That's the kind of thing, that's how it gets interesting, is getting these various different things and finding ways to put them together. Because my goal with this stuff is really being able to put together a kind of side Airwindows business where I can start selling this in different ways. Because similarly to Airwindows itself, if I started making these, like literally these, if I took something and it was looking almost exactly like this, and you were able to buy it or like eBayed them or something, so that it became a thing where the ones that I handmade could start bringing me enough money to put in a bird thing on my chimney so they don't cause me to stroke out and die from panic from having birds flying around in my house. That's a way that I could earn money doing that. But I would also be completely committed to working out the design, coming up with like a PDF or something, or printing out a way to, how do you do this? I'll like draw some stuff up with pens and things. I'll make cartoons of them or something. I'll do it in some kind of way that's just cool. And explain to people, if you have these parts, this is how you wire them together with a soldering iron. This is how you position them. This is the spacing of the holes that you use for putting this size of hole here. This is the size of drill bit that you need. You make dots on the back wall of this so that with another size of drill bit, you just enlarge the holes in the perf board, and then you can stick this on, and then it is mechanically solid. And it makes it a little bit sturdier, and you also have this area available for, you'll stick in other parts for your design so that it doesn't have to get wider if you don't want it to. And, well, that's how they get you. The birds aren't big enough to kill you themselves, so what they do is they make you go and explode. Your blood comes shooting out of your eyes and nose. And, So the idea is, I am more than happy to start building these. I've been moving towards that for a long time. In fact, this is one of the things that I do for fun. When I have to put aside the plugins and things and the wood stove and all that kind of stuff, I start putting together stuff like this just because it's what I do. And I'd be more than happy to do them, but I'm not really geared. Like, I don't have a production line. I don't have a company in China or Taiwan or whatever to assemble stuff like this for me. I could not compete with, say, Behringer for producing stuff at a competitive rate in volume, in bulk. And these things don't have printed circuits, so I also can't get printed circuits and have a robot put together the stuff and wire it up and then just be selling them. And when you do that, you start having to order large quantities of things, and you're throwing, thousands of dollars towards production runs of stuff, which means your price has to get more expensive. But what I'm looking to do is find ways of getting large quantities of parts. Like, I can order lots of these little jacks. I have lots of these little jacks. It's even easier to order lots of the little chips because those get to be down to about 28 cents in volume for the guts of how the thing works. The perf board is kind of expensive-ish, but you can buy them in large enough planks and then chop them up, and it winds up being fairly, I would have to calculate it out because there's a certain amount of wastage on the edges, and then you sort of just score them and snap them, like divvy them up in certain ways. And I find that kind of stuff relaxing and fun, so I like doing that. So on the one hand, I will be building things using wire and these parts, because the side effect of it is it's kind of like my Analog Man Stompbox pedals, where if you're building a circuit like this and you put it together using big, heavy point-to-point wire, you get a sound quality difference from if you had put it together using incredibly delicate printed circuit traces that all fit on this particular panel in this width. And so it's like, wow, it's a delight of micro miniaturization. Yeah, well, that's true, but you also suffer as far as, there's capacitance between the traces. The traces can be really, really small. If you look at the old Moog modulars, the 6U modulars, what you find is that they have giant parts, giant jacks, giant potentiometers rather than these guys that are small and kind of miniaturized. And you look at the circuit boards when they show you pictures of like, oh, look, this is our circuit board. The circuit boards are giant traces, and they're giant traces that are tinned with solder. So part of the reason that 6U modular, like 6U classic Moog modular, has a special sound is because it's a bunch of little parts much like this. I mean, they're not literally CMOS chips necessarily, although sometimes they even are. But they're these little chips that are being wired together by technology that's like it's from the 1950s or whatever. It's like very retro in style. Like traces that would carry more voltage than these jumper cables, put it that way. And when you do that, things happen. Like if your circuit needs to charge up this capacitor before something else happens, and you're doing this, gate charges thing and so on, and you have a giant, huge trace that can carry 6 amps worth of power, then your thing that comes in and charges the capacitor basically charges the capacitor instantly. Whereas if it's sitting on a tiny, delicate little printed circuit trace, it's going to slow stuff down a little bit. Speaking of which, there's another neat trick that is possible to do that I'm looking forward to experimenting with at some point. I mentioned that you can do this thing where you're going into a capacitor and you have a comparator after it. Those can be made of op amps. And there's a feedback to the positive side of the op amp. And what it means is that high voltages automatically go to high voltages and low voltages automatically go to low voltages. And if you force it in one direction, it will end up just totally going to that direction. You can get op amps, and I have 100 of the chips for, I think it's a 4230, an NJM 4230. That is the op amp. It's a single op amp on a chip that lives inside EMG 81 pickups. The reason it lives inside EMG 81 pickups is because it's a low power op amp. It is low energy consumption. And the reason it does that is because it's also the same chip in that blue lantern filter that I'm pointing at over there. You may or may not be able to see. It says sour filter. It says LM4250. It's 4250 is what it is. The LM4250 sour filter is one of the most brutally harsh and insane sounding filters because it's using this op amp that is ultra low power to the point where you can set it up to pull almost no current. And a current is what it uses to switch from high voltage to low voltage. So instead of having a gate that looks like this, you have a gate that looks like this. You see what this means, of course. Hardware slew rate limiter. Hardware slew rate limiter that also saves in power for your power supply. So any op amp, anything like this, where it could be the comparator to make gates go on and off, it's a op amp. You can run a voltage through it. You can have it take in a balanced input and hook it to the plus and minus and give it a unbalanced output. So it's a buffer stage. It's an op amp. You can do anything with it. And this is the op amp where the slew rate does this when you set it up to use almost no power. So I have 100 of these. It's just waiting for me to find time to do something with them. And if I'm able to do that, I'll be able to start doing things like building stuff where it's maybe say a crazy filter using that is built using like this Amphenol connector. I think it is a good quality jack. It's larger than people usually use for Eurorack, but that's because the internals of it I think are stronger than you usually use for Eurorack, and it's also very inexpensive. It's not the sturdiest thing in the world. You don't take a big wrench and tighten this nut down, because if you do, you pull the threaded part through and destroy the jack. So careful. You gotta assemble it to sort of finger tightness. But that would also mean that then I could take these op amps that I have access to and use those for whatever crazy, grungy, slew rate removed thing. And then it would also eat less power, so it would be more friendly to the rest of your Eurorack or your system or whatever. You'd be able to run the thing that you built with less power. And the other thing about doing stuff like this, about using a op amp where you can bias it to have a slowed onset and release, where it just can't respond fast because it's operating on sort of power starved mode. That will give the circuit that you build, say, this is a drum thing or whatever. So you can make your drum thing and it's like a kick drum or a hat or something like that. And if you design it with those op amps with the slew restrictions, you start getting this grungy intensity going on that's kind of like, Polavox or whatever. And because some of those things are not entirely about just the magic of the particular design, it's very much like what I've done with Airwindows plugins. These things aren't always about vintage mojo. Sometimes they're just only about selecting the right part and using it in a certain way. You can take a thing and the right bits, the right parts and selections and things like that, and make a crazy oscillator or filter that like roars like some crazy vintage thing, and all the parts cost like $4. Which means I could sell them and wire them up and build them myself. I'll build some extra ones, put them on eBay, hope that people get really excited and fight each other for them. But then also, because this has been the plan the entire time, make available the collections of parts for basically at cost. Just what it would cost for me to replace them. And that would mean I could start being the conduit for whatever parts it needs to people who wouldn't be able to necessarily win an eBay battle for the personally crisp built and wired up thing and stuff. And it's also very Airwindowsy because it is like it doesn't look like anything very much, but the underlying design concepts are just stripped down to be it is the maximally effective way of doing this particular thing with no additional gloss. This is a generic hardware. It's literally the bits of circuitry and such, and the little tabs on the potentiometers that go out are sort of splayed out so that it holds it onto this part, and this part's bolted onto this part. And then we start soldering to things on the other side of this perf board that holds it on too. And it's all just utterly and totally functional. It's just the most raw functional thing that you could have. Well, yeah, David is saying don't do it at cost. Well, I'm put it this way: if like Santa came down my chimney along with several birds and said, "Here, you have all of the money you want for all the parts that you could get," at that point I would want to do it at cost, because it would no longer be a thing about I must make money doing the thing. I mean, you know that Airwindows, I already don't. I'm at cost on Airwindows plugins making. Because rather than demand that people pay me in order for me to keep doing the thing, I've set it up in such a way that I can continue it, and that's basically how I do and why I do. So I would have to argue with you on that. If you really need, what happens basically is if I start doing this, and as you can see, I'm moving in this direction, I would arrange it so that I am a conduit for people getting these kits, and I draw up like some nice cartoons, with a cartoon bird, showing you how you wire this stuff up and what gets wired to what and how you connect them and how you solder them and stuff. And then I'd set it up in such a way that I would be doing some of them myself. I can't take all of my time doing it, but if it turned really profitable, that would become great. It's like the guy that does the Klon Centaur. You ever heard of the Klon Centaur? Some of you probably have. It's a music and audio thing. That guy came up with a rather sophisticated and complicated stomp box pedal that's like a little compressy and a little soft clippy and stuff. And it's considered to be one of the best, or certainly most valuable, is incontrovertible, one of the best overdrives you can possibly have. And he'd make them in these little sort of custom-made boxes, like powder cast kind of things, and wire up the circuit and put that in there. I think he maybe covered it all up in epoxy or something, which is not what I would do. I'm doing open source hardware. And he started selling them, and people started really liking it. And now you can get a Klon Centaur type thing in a couple of different ways. I don't remember who this guy is, but I like him. One way of getting a Klon Centaur is buy one of the ones that he made over the years of while I was making it, because he stopped making them in a particular kind of way at a certain point. It's going to cost you like $5,000 or $6,000 to buy a Klon Centaur. One of the earliest ones with like the cartoon horse on it, it's a cartoon centaur, the horsey centaur. You could spend $3,000 for one of them. They come in silver and gold. The color is the only thing that changes, but people do believe that they recognize differences in the sound as well, which the guy is like, no, there's no differences in the sound. But it doesn't matter. It's gone into that zone where it's like a Mona Lisa or whatever. It's scarcity and coolness factor is driving it. And when you buy them in that way, the people who made them, or the people that he cares about, get nothing. Just like selling like investment grade art, that the artist doesn't get nothing. It's all about rich people exchanging things and stuff that they consider to be valuable or important. You can also get a Klon KTR. The KTR is the same kind of thing, except for when the guy with the original thing had like switchcraft jacks and stuff, and it was all point-to-point wired and various things. The KTR is designed in such a way where you can get them mass-produced a little bit more. So you can get a circuit board, and the circuit board is slightly different, because the traces are different, or he's using surface mount technology for some things. And on the whole, it's basically the same thing. But he was able to put it together in such a way that he could automate it, that he could get like circuit designs on that. And on the top of the Klon KTR is written the words, "Please don't blame me for the insanity of the collectible versions of these pedals. That's not my doing and it wasn't my intention." Or something along those lines. He has a little thing written on the top of the actual pedal that says, "Hey man, the stuff that was going on with these valuable ones is not my fault. I wasn't set up to do that." Or you can try to get a clone, because there are people that try to do clones of the $5,000 version. And here's the thing. I mentioned like eBaying and like hand building stuff like this, and the prospects of, on the one hand, essentially selling off parts for doing your own versions of these things. Like, learn to take care of yourself and do your own soldering and build them for yourself so that you can have much more that way. And that would be at cost. The guy that did the Klon Centaur still has some of the cases that the original Klon Centaurs go in. And he still has some of the circuit boards, although he stopped making them. So here's what he does. He has personal friends. Like, he's fine at this point. He has been making these things. He can retire. He has no problems. He's got stuff covered, like his house is paid for or whatever. And he has friends who are not so lucky. So what he does is, if he needs to help his friend, like I believe there's a single mom that is a friend of his, and she's having a hard time, or was having a hard time at certain times, and just is in rough shape and needs help. What he will do is this. He will take one of his old enclosures, which he still's got enclosures, and he stopped making the things. He'll take his old circuit boards, and he will build a new Klon Centaur the way they used to be made. Just one, personally. Build it by hand, the way that he built all of those things by hand. He did not have some kind of, company in Taiwan or whatever doing it. And then he will give that new vintage pedal to his friend who puts it on eBay. And she'll sell it, and it'll typically get like, $2,000 or $3,000 or whatever, because this is a unavailable thing. It's exactly the same as one of the vintage ones. And that's what he does. And I simply love that. I would love to get into a position where I can do things like that. Like have these designs for these crazy Airwindows styley. And again, you heard this one on the music stream last week. I'll be trying to continue to include them. I may or may not be able to have one going on tomorrow. But or I might try to do something entirely different with it. But I want to get into that zone, even if it's in a small way. And it would also help do things like, fix the problem with the birds getting into my chimney and frightening me. Or, other stuff like that. There's help that I still need for myself. It's not just all about, like, I want to find people that I know who are in hardship and earn money to turn over to them. I'm going to want to go there eventually. If I can get myself out of the hole and stop being poor as dirt, probably eventually I can, then I'm going to want to turn around to help others. But that's the way I'm going to want to do it. I'm going to want to do it like, I build these hardware things of which you can't like download this. I could try to model it. It ain't going to be the same. If you're modeling something that is a power-starved CMOS chip running through a bunch of really good hardware and analog gear to a good solid output jack and stuff, like, you're not going to be able to model that super effectively. How do you even work out how all these little transistors as part of the chip behave when you start giving them lower voltages, the voltage fluctuates or whatever? Each chip is slightly different. That's only exacerbated as you start like power starving it and doing stuff like that. And those are the ways that you get the really cool noises. So I'm going to be wanting to go in that direction. I'm going to be wanting to go in the direction of making these designs and perfecting them just the way that I try to perfect some of the plugins. And I do also have other plugin ideas that I want to develop. And then having this become basically open source hardware. There's a lot of people doing open source hardware out there. The whole maker thing, which has kind of fizzled lately, but honestly, it still has legs, means that people can build their own stuff if they know how, they have the right basic parts and figure out how to do it. And then start putting this stuff out there at cost so that I can get parts into people's hands, and that'd be fun. As long as I was able to handle it and it wasn't too overwhelming or eating up all of my time just redistributing parts. But it would get paid for because I would be making some things myself. And then I'd just be like, okay, I just made this, and I can put it in a fancy box and send it out to somebody, and I'll make a video for it, and the video shows the exact thing, the exact one that you would get, and I would put it through its paces and demonstrate it, and it would be fun. It would be a pleasing way of combining, free and open source work and sort of artisanal synthesizer making. And yep. So I see in the chat there is a bit of contention or discussion or whatever. So it feels kind of like somebody had a question and I missed it. So let me scroll up and see where there is that. As David correctly says, I get distracted by the stuff I'm thinking about. That's always the way it is, though. That's how I am all the time. For instance, I'm also thinking to my head, definitely the next thing I'm going to try with this stupid bird is to cover up the front of the stove even more with more shirts and things. Open up that bag so that there's like a place to go, and remove the bottom panel thing, and then shine a bright light through the dark plastic bag to try to lure the bird through the thing into the bag, and then seal it up. And if I'll be finished with the thing soon enough. What I'm very likely to do at that stage is, if I can, especially if I can stick the bottom plate back on with the bird still in the bag, and I can remove the bag, and I'm like, okay, now I have a bag with a bird in it. I'm going to get in my car and drive somewhere else and release the bird somewhere else that's far away from my chimney and be like, yeah, please be lost. Don't come back. Because otherwise it's going to try to go into the same stupid chimney. If I release it on my doorstep, it'll try to go to the same place because it seems to be the same one. I think it's probably the same one going to the same place. So I need to go to like Tijuana. I'll drive to Kansas and release it there, right? I don't think I would necessarily go all that far, but far enough to confuse it a bit, and then just hope that helped. Because I don't want to kill the bird. It didn't do anything wrong other than be incredibly stupid. So, let's see. People are asking repeatedly about some stuff. I still hear the bird in there, so there's potential for me being able to do something. And at least it is able to sort of fend for itself, and we will just see how exciting all this gets. But I'm not going to... You don't get to watch that. It's going to be less stressful for me if the stream is over, so sorry. Maybe I'll tweet, ironically, that I successfully solved it. Let's see now. Yeah, I could do merch because I have a logo and it is my own creation. I have that logo with the clipper, the Airwindows dog, as an SVG, so I could make it the size of the house. Airwindows house, yay. Technically, this is. Iru was asking, which is my most musical plugin. I can't answer that. Depends upon what you mean. Depends upon what you're trying to do. I do get that the description of not rough sounding narrows things down a bit. So in terms of saturation plugins, you want Spiral more than other ones, because Spiral is the least rough sounding of just gentle overdrive. If you're looking at compressy style things, you want Curve, like lowercase Curve is the gentlest, least rough sounding compressy style thing that I've got. It's incredibly subtle. If you're looking for filtering, you should try Capacitor. Capacitor is the gentlest, most musical sounding, while still being a striking effect, equalizer type thing. It's a high pass and a low pass that combine together. So that would be that. So I'm doing pretty well at being able to answer that question. I'm not positive about 2-tape 5. There's probably still work to be done about that. David mentions from tape. I would co-sign that. Tape effects. For the gentlest, smoothest one, you should try from tape, because that too is subtle and doesn't do too many things. And yeah. Unbox is okay, but I'm not sure it's that great. It certainly doesn't compare to Spiral as far as ultimate cleanness is concerned. It's just a good experiment for what it is. I would point to 2-vinyl. I would point to acceleration rather than 2-vinyl for high frequency limiting. That's very good at being musical sounding and not having any rough or ugly or unpleasant qualities going on. Neither raw timbers nor raw glitters. You're going to want the Not Just Another Dither out of Studio Tan for the most musical word length reducer. And Bo, FIR window, yeah. The problem, Bo, with an FIR window is this. If you're doing oversampling, you're doing sample rate converting. If you're doing sample rate converting, you are typically going to be using a FIR window, although not automatically. It is possible to do like a biquad or something as your sample rate conversion. And you'd be upsampling in a certain way and then doing a filter to downsample, and that is a way of doing it, certainly. And in fact, it might even be a good way of doing it and something that could be experimented with. But the issue with an FIR filter is twofold. One, if you're trying to do linear phase, that means that the kernel of your frequency thing that you're using has to go both directions from the point that you're on, meaning that you're adding latency, and I don't usually run latency. Secondly, the bigger the filter, the more processing is required to do it. Like the sample rate converter that I like using these days is an older one for OS X called Brick. And with that one, you get to basically define it like, okay, our sample rate, our FIR filter is literally the size of the entire audio. You can have filters of like billions. And the deal with that is it just grinds. You have to run it offline. You can't run it even in a relatively modern computer. It can't do real time. It has to do like 1/10 of the speed because there's so much calculating being done. The reason you do that is as long as you're doing that much calculating, you might as well go whole hog and just go completely bonkers with it, and it gets glorious, spectacular results sound-wise because it's gone beyond the, do less processing to do all of the processing, and the result is magical to the degree that you've just gone into total overkill. You can do that. You can do like either or. But the medium ones, and this is where the FIR window thing comes in, you start doing medium ones where you can do a fairly fast filter. So your FIR window, rather than being 10 billion, is like 128. So you're doing a 128 tap filter, and it is an FIR filter, and that's not really good enough to do a serious SRC algorithm. Instead, what you're going to get is, aliasing, failure to go all the way up to the Nyquist frequency. It's going to just start showing faults, and the smaller your FIR window, the more faults it will have, but the more easily it will run. And again, anytime you're doing this in a plugin, because you're like, my plugin should be oversampling, what's happening is every single plugin that does that starts eating up all of the resources. And since you're running on a bus that's like 32 or 64-bit floating point at a given frequency, there is no actual way to go, this plugin transposes everything up to 8 times the frequency, and then here's the list of plugins, and then we transport it back down. It's like, no, you can't do that unless you're controlling the DAW in a rather special way. You could program a DAW to do that, and I'm a bit surprised nobody's tried. It seems kind of obvious for when people are trying to do oversampling anyway. I'm a little surprised. But then you could also do it by just telling your DAW, yeah, you run at 192K now, and then just load in a bunch of 44.1K files. And what's going to happen is the DAW is going to either, and Whitesea was talking about this in one of his streams. In fact, he had like a special thing for making your mixdowns better, which was completely valid because he found a way for, rather than processing things at the given sample rate, he found a way to sort of override that in such a way where it was processing stuff at a higher sample rate. Offline, I guess, is what it was doing. And so that's what you want to do if you can. And the deal with that is it's generally better to do it. And if you were trying to do a string of plugins and have them be oversampled, because that's clearly the next question is like, Chris, can you do a plugin that goes, encodes into oversampling, and then you get to use a bunch of plugins and then decodes out of oversampling? And the answer to that is no, I can't do that one. That requires hooks that are too deep into the DAW, like changing the sampling rate for the DAW in the middle of the stream. So basically in that situation, what you want to do is just tell the DAW to be a different sampling rate and go from there. So is that enough of an answer about the FIR window? I saw Whitesey's thing on the earbuds and stuff, but I still am not persuaded that using headphones in mixing is necessarily great. Plus also, it concerned me a little bit that he was working on all the sounds in solo and making them all be more even. And as you remember, I am a big believer of resonance and comb filtery effects and dips and cuts and boosts and things, and I like doing resonant effects. So what he was doing in my world is kinda like I would do that stuff with drums and percussive elements. Like if you have a percussive element, like a snare or a kick drum, if I ever do get into the Evergreen Records thing, which is not happening next month, so I'll tell you that, obviously. I'll be lucky if I don't lose ground next month, because it's not building up as fast as it drops off at the beginning of the month, really. But that's how that works. But if I ever start doing the Evergreen thing, I'll be showing spectrograms, even if I have to go to a lot of trouble to make it happen. I'll be showing spectrograms of hit records, and you will see on the sonogram of the record the way in which classic hit record kicks and snares and things like that show up as like vertical bars without hotspots and highlights and things like that, because much like what Whitesea was doing in his video, with your hit records, people like to hear kicks and snares and things which are like that. He was doing stuff which was entirely relevant to percussive elements and backgrounds, and not nearly so relevant in terms of like flavor and color and stuff. So it's a piece of the puzzle. He needs to not use that for every possible element as just a sort of guideline, but more isolate it to where it counts and where it helps. So on that, I'm going to, have a glance at the final bits of the chat, and it's almost time for me to head off and sort of do my thing. And I'm thinking by the end of the day, this bird is going to be rescued, and it might live in Toledo from now on. I have a Eno album. However, Eno's hit quality is not quite the same as like typical rock production, so it doesn't really quite work. Although I know a bunch of Eno's stuff, so that could conceivably be a much more philosophical discussion rather than the nuts and bolts, here's how you make mixing consoles do this discussion that the more classic evergreen albums would become. So, on that note, this has been a really interesting live stream. You don't usually get to watch my wood stove, much less watch my wood stove with a bird frickin' flapping around trying to tear its way through the metal of the stove. That's colorful. I'm very pleased that I pointed the microphone at you guys. Pointed the microphone at the stove so that you guys plainly heard it, because when this kind of stuff happens, until I resolve the situation, that's how difficult it is to focus and work and, just sort of coexist in my house. It's like, wow, crazy loud metallic banging noise from nowhere because a live animal is in my house trying to burst free. It's if you're making fun of me for turning red when stuff like that happens, it's like, yeah, put a wild animal in your house and have it try to burst free and see how well you take it. It's definitely one of the challenges. Oh, I have no intention of trying to kill the bird. I mean, I'm warming to the idea of like trying to drive it to Tijuana at this stage. I'll go and get it some bird feed or something. It'll be like, okay, here, you escape, and not only that, here is some food. Now be somewhere else. So, go figure. But we will see. In any event, I think that is as far as I need to go, and with any kind of luck, the bird thing will be resolved by tomorrow. And I'm going to see whether I can't get into a zone of like, we're now shipping this bird to Albuquerque. So, on that note, I will probably be catching up with you guys. Like, I should be able to do a music jam tomorrow, and I'll probably be able to do music jam next week. And honestly, over the next week, I think you can see that I need to chill down a little bit. So, I'll catch back up with you. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on the forums and things. Like if there are bug fixes that need to be done, I'm going to have to drop everything and do those like I did last week. That's always rather stressful too, is when I have to scramble and do a bug fix. But this is probably a good stage for people to have new stuff to play with. You got Biquad, you got Mojo, you got Dino. There's a bunch of things for people to get used to. And I never even started making notes on how I'm going to assemble subsets of the plugins so that I can distribute stuff and say, oh, you want to make retro sounds? What you need to do is download this zip file, which is this smaller set of plugins, not all of them. And here's a block diagram of where you put them in your DAW. And you put them in this way, and you set it up like this. Do that, and then start using it and see if that does you any good. And of course, you can always just go and download new updates.zip and like grab other things out of it anytime you want. But it's getting to where people really need to have a cut down, curated version of things. And so even though we didn't talk about that because we were talking about birds and perfboard and God knows what, I'll chill out. I'll catch you guys later. And see you later.